Welcome to Promote, Profit, Publish. I'm your host, Juliet Clark, and I'm pretty excited about today's guest. I have been trying to get him for 6 months, and he was a guest in 2020, but now what he talked about in 2020 is up and running, and I think it's going to be super helpful for you guys. But before I get started with that, want to invite you guys to go over to Breakthrough Author Magazine. Grab your free subscription, breakthroughauthormagazine.com. We have some new contributors in 2023, and I'm super excited about them because I think they're going to be really helpful for those of you who are authors, coaches, and speakers. We've added Nina Frohreep. Nina has been a producer in New York for some of the top shows on television. And she's actually our new video and video marketing expert, her and Robin Stilt, who, if you guys participated in the 10-day author platform building challenge, you've already been exposed to them. We've also added Jackie Jordan, the founder of TV Guestbert. She is our in-house media expert and has gotten a lot of our clients on TV, radio, newspaper articles, magazine articles. So she is truly, truly an expert. And she also was part of the New York producer crowd for some of the morning shows there. So 2 people with a lot of experience in this industry. Also, starting in February, Tracy Hazard has come on full time. And you guys all know Tracy's one of my favorites. I just love her as a person. Even though my podcast is through her, she and I have become great friends over the years. And she's going to be taking on more podcasting as they are expanding their empire from just Poditize to a new product called Podlister. They have a lot going on over there to really help authors, coaches, and speakers. So I'm excited that all 3 of those guys have decided to come on full time, and Sarah's back. So I'm excited about that too. She's back in the January issue. So the second thing we have going on is the biggest thing that happened last year was authors coming to us that wrote their book and hadn't built their author avatar. And what that is who your ideal readers are. So I took my marketing research experience from the ad world and the publishing world, and I combined them into a course, and it's called Build Your Author Avatar. You can find it at buildyourauthoravatar.com. And it's $97. I made it really easy. If you have an online business or you're thinking about writing a book, this is where you really drill down into the market research you need and the market validation. We actually had this as the precursor, the pre-homework for our I Love Content class last quarter. And people loved it. They came to the first call and they're like, I'm a little bit confused now because I thought my audience was this and they weren't buying, they weren't really engaged. And now that I've sort of redone this, my audience is this instead, and I'm getting more connection and engagement. So really encourage you to go over and check it out. We made it $97 because we want everybody to be able to do the proper market research that so many small companies don't do. So you can find that at buildyourauthoravatar.com. Avatar is AVATAR, just like the movie, and you can grab it for $97. So today's guest is Alex Sanfilippo, and we had him on in 2020, and he had an idea. He's a big podcaster. He does a lot of podcasting events. And at the time, he had the idea for Podmatch. Well, Podmatch is a reality now, and I use it. I have a lot of my clients that use it. It's inexpensive, but it's a great way to get yourself booked out on podcasts. Alex Sanfilippo is the host of the top-rated podcast called Podcasting Made Simple. He's also the founder of podpros.com, a software company focused specifically on the podcasting industry. Alex and his team have created the popular services like Podmatch, a service that matches podcast guests and hosts together for interviews, and Podcast SOP, a project management tool that helps podcasters keep up with their episode releases. So I hope you guys will listen to this interview. Go check out Podmatch. I use it myself I love it, because if there's one thing I can't stand, it's all these publicity people reaching out to me to sell their people to me, and they've never listened to my show. They have no idea if their people will be a good fit. I've never talked to them. And so this is a way to be matched with someone whose resume looks like it'd be a good fit for your show, and evaluate it and decide. Just this morning, and I'm recording this on December 5th or December 6th, just this morning, I picked up somebody who was a really good match and reached out to her, and hopefully we'll have her on the show in 2023. So it's a great way for, as a podcast host, you to be in control, but also it's a great way to reach out if you want to be on podcasts. So stay tuned, and here's our interview with Alex. Alex, welcome. You finally had time to do this. I've been trying to get him for 3 or 4 months now. So I know you're a busy guy, and I appreciate you being on.
Juliet, I am so excited to be here. I am sorry it took me so long. That's one of my least favorite things, is having a busy schedule, and we just made it public to the world. But thank you for having me.
Well, that's a good thing, being busy. So I really love it. You were on my show back in 2020, and I believe Podmatch was just like an idea in your head. You hadn't really executed yet. So can you talk about, where'd you get the idea? How did all this come into play?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. When do you know when that episode came out? I want to go back and listen to that again. It's funny. I was looking for that episode when I was listening to your podcast today, but I kept on like finding episodes. I was like, ooh, this sounds interesting. So I kept on like going on like these little side quests instead of finding that actual episode. But I think it was before, it was sometime in 2020, it was before Podmatch completely, right? I don't think we even talked about it all, did we?
We didn't. And back then I was coaching with, I think I came into awareness because I was coaching with Scott Carson, and Scott and Tracy said, you need to go check this guy out. He's doing some really great stuff. But you were podcasting then. So
right.
Good for you, coming up with finding a need and filling it.
Yeah, thanks. And I can definitely speak to that point. Like I'm still a podcaster, by the way. It's important to share that, but I can jump straight into the story if you'd like me to do that, to kind of bring everyone up to speed. So yeah, years ago when we first met, and last time we did an interview, if you link to it, I'm going to go back and listen to it for sure. And also hear how far I've come to see if I sound any better or worse now, So, but yeah, I was just a podcaster, but I really fell in love with the industry. Like I met people like Juliet that just have so much experience in their craft. Like you meet these people and you're like, my goodness, I can't believe these people like talk to me. Right. Like, it's just like really an amazing thing to be in this space. So I really fell in love with it. And what I was doing back then was really learning how to become an entrepreneur that was really service-based, someone that could really serve the world. Now, I came from the aerospace industry, and not that I wasn't serving the world, but like when I was in, and by the way, I wasn't an astronaut, wasn't a skydiver, wasn't a fighter pilot. Like I worked behind a computer. We were a parts support company that focused below the atmosphere, as boring as it gets. I loved it, but like I never felt like I was making a big difference, right? And I think maybe if I drilled down to it, I was, but I just knew I wanted to be an entrepreneur that was directly serving somebody and knowing that there was an impact being made. Didn't need to be a lot of people, just wanted to serve somebody. And anyway, I learned through my own podcast how to be an entrepreneur, and thankfully that show did really well. So I was speaking on a lot of podcast stages, and one of them in 2020, actually, I've just asked a question to anyone who had talked to me that was in podcasting. What are you struggling with? What are you struggling with in podcasting? And I repeatedly heard a lot of things, but what was the repetitive thing that I heard was, Alex, I'm having trouble finding ideal guests for my show. And I really thought about that. I'm like, man, that was my problem when I first got started. Like it really, I remember that being my problem. And I'm thankful that my show landed at the right time, maybe had the right niche, but it took off. So I overcame that problem a lot faster than most people would. And that was really just luck and timing, right? Like I know I did a good job and everything, but at the end of the day, I was like, this problem is real. And it probably would have caused me to stop years ago if I didn't just launch at the right time. And anyway, long story short, I came home to the whiteboard, and I wasn't as quick as I thought I was, Juliet. Like I thought I'd just be able to like whip out this brilliant idea. And like I was baffled by it. I'm like, I don't know how to like there's booking agencies. Like I don't know what to do. There's some sort of resources out there, but I just couldn't seem to figure out the solution I wanted to offer. And then one day I was actually, this is like when the world was shut down basically. And so I was working out, I was working at my house, and I just, while I was working out, I just had the idea. I ran back inside my whiteboards, which are actually behind where I'm recording right now, behind this screen behind me. And I wrote it out. And what I wrote down was, dating app, but for podcast guests and hosts. And that was like just the initial thing I wrote down. I was like, okay, what does this look like? And running through my thought process, I was like, you know what? Podcast hosts are having trouble finding ideal guests. What's an industry that does that well? All my friends that were single were like, well, dating apps are how I find girls to go on dates with, right? Because we have same interests and stuff like that. I'm like, that's an industry that's doing it right. At least I thought. I've been married too long to actually use one, but from what I was told, they were working really well. And yeah, so I just was like, you know what? Let's bring this idea to podcasting. So then we created podmatch.com, which literally is a software that automatically connects guests and hosts together for podcast interviews based off what the show's looking for and the guest's expertise. If they align, they match, then an interview can happen. And I just said a lot right there, Juliet, but that's exactly what we set out to build. And throughout 2020, that's what we made happen.
Yeah. And it's funny because I found you again as Podmatch because I hadn't heard about it. Tracy Hazard, I was complaining to her about, I get these emails all day long from PR agencies. I have somebody for your show. And I can tell from those emails that these agencies, they haven't listened to my show. They haven't vetted the guests. They have no idea, what we serve up on the show and who our ideal audience is. And I was just frustrated. And I have to say, this journey with it, I can see why you found the niche. As I've gone through the journey, I now have a sign-up form. I will vet somebody and have a pre-interview. And so there's just all these things that you learn along the way that I feel like your site just takes out of my purview. Like I can just go on the site. Just this morning, I had a match and I had 3 matches. I chose one of them. She was perfect. So was that your intention? And what do you do for the host? What was your vision for the hosting part of this?
Yeah, really, I love hearing you say that, Juliet. Thank you so much for sharing that. And that's exactly what we set out to do. And so, like, I'll share the date of the idea. Like the day I had the idea and wrote down on a whiteboard was, wow, now it's a little bit foggy because it's been a few years, right? It was March 10th, 2020 is when I wrote that down. And what you're talking about now is exactly what we set out to solve. And on June 15th, 2020, we launched into an early beta alpha test, whatever you want to call it, with the exact intent of, can we help solve the problem of having trouble finding my ideal guest? Can we just find it and make it happen, right? And from there, we expanded upon it because back then, like, it's funny, I didn't have a logo or anything. Super slow, no logo, mostly text-based. And one of the first pieces of feedback we got was like, yeah, it definitely works, but it's super ugly. I was like, noted. We'll work on that, right? Like, and I'm big on like, let's launch it as soon as we can to see if it solves that problem. So like you just said, like our goal was to say, hey, I'm a podcast host and I want to guest. I live in Jacksonville, Florida, near the beach. I want a guest that can talk about surfing. So what you do is you go in there, you set the guest you're looking for, and the system will automatically say, hey, here's a professional surfer that's on the platform. Does that seem like the right fit? If it's a yes, you message back and forth. You've got all their details. Like they have a media one sheet built in. So you have their photos, their social media links, questions are ready to be asked, like all these things built in. The idea was, can we just simplify the process for a podcast host so they don't have to do all the heavy lifting and just trying to figure out all the things they can? Because as you know, being a podcast host is a labor of love. Like interviewing a guest, unless you're just like somebody who just like, yeah, you seem good, let's go, and they know nothing about it. But if you're gonna do any form of research, there's some work that goes into it. We wanted to basically say, hey, let's get that person in front of each other, but now let's help them do some of the work that's involved and just, again, streamline the parts that can be streamlined.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I love. So on the other side of it, as a guest, we send our clients over to you guys a lot because they need to build a platform, they need to get out, and unfortunately, most authors wait until their book is done. So we are really encouraging them, if you're an expert writing a book, go get yourself on Podmatch now, get all your assets in place. This is your media kit for bigger things when you launch. So what did you have in mind for the guests when you, the guesting on there?
Yeah, first off, for anyone who's listening now and is one of those like really proactive people that's already typing in the website as you're hearing this, make sure you go to joinpodmatch.com/superbrand, joinpodmatch.com/superbrand. That will ensure that you always get the best pricing, the best option. Juliet Clark is the reason that you're getting that. So make sure that you go through that link, because again, that'll make sure that you're always getting something exclusive. So again, joinpodmatch.com/superbrand. Yeah. So on this side of the mic, if you will, like we've got the hosting side and the guesting side. First off, so important. Like I love the name of the podcast, Promote, Profit, Publish. Like it's not publish then the other things, right? Like it starts with promoting. And we see that problem all the time. Authors come in, they're like, hey, I just launched a book. I want to get on some podcasts now. It's like, great. You should have started 6 months ago. Like, cause
Yeah.
like that's kind of like, it comes out over time. But yeah, it's so important to just get on there as early as you can, get those reps in and stuff like that. And so for me, I'm a big proponent of like always podcast guesting, not just like when a launch is coming out. Like it's just part of my ongoing strategy. I'm not like, sorry, you have to wait till next time I have something going on. I might not do as much all the time, but I'm always going to make sure I'm doing some form of podcast guesting. And so we designed it again, like with the host in mind initially, but then we realized like authors like to be on podcasts and they add a lot of value when they're on podcasts, right? So like we wanted to make sure that we built the platform out in a way that would help them as well. And I mentioned earlier, we have basically their profile as a media one sheet, which has things like their bio they want a host to read. It has their social media links. It has questions that they're always ready to be asked. It has things like ideas for titles, their long description about themselves, like all these things I'm mentioning that are so important that, again, a host is going to look for anyway. But when you give them this media one sheet, the problem it solves is me getting on with you and you ask me questions about things I don't want to talk about, right? Like it has nothing to do with my book, right? Or something like that. And we've seen that happen when you don't use a program like this. The host might go on, ooh, look at this huge like publication that was done 5 years ago about this guest. But the guest doesn't want to talk about that anymore, but they did all the research based around that. What you're doing is you're not taking away the uniqueness of the interview. You're giving a host the framework of creativity you want them to act within. You kind of control the direction of it with something like a media one sheet. And that's, at the very least, like even if you don't use Podmatch, having this media one sheet, I think is just a necessity for any podcast guest. And Juliet, I don't know if I answered your question exactly. I went on a little rant there. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. You did answer it, but I just want to go back to what you said about the 6 months. If you're an expert and you are gathering an audience for a book, being on 6 months to a year out, that gets people used to seeing your face on Medium or hearing what you have to say and giving them the opportunity to follow you on social media, get more value from your content. And so it's sort of being on a podcast is equivalent to your awareness campaign. So, there are those 3 stages, the awareness, the book is the nurture, and then leading them to those bigger ticket revenue items. So it behooves you to be out there and polished, and even taking some of those podcasts and putting them on your website in your actual media kit. So people get a real sense of, is this person right? Will they be a good fit? So you're doing yourself a favor by getting on something like this and actually maybe even getting some feedback from some of those hosts who chose you. So I love that you said that. The last thing you want to do is get your book out, and then your first interview is after, because your first, I don't know about you, but my first interviews sucked. So you want to be polished and ready to go when the time is right. So I love that you said that about that.
I'm scared of my old interviews, Juliet, so I may not. I don't know if I was good or bad, but we're going to keep it at that, I think.
It's funny. Tracy Hazard told me early on, she said, their thing is it's bingeable. So they're like, somebody will catch an episode, then they'll go all the way back to the beginning. And as I went along, I was like, oh God, help me. Please don't let them go back to the
right. Oh, that's so funny. You bring up another point here, though, that I think is worth touching on that people don't think about. I had I've only heard this happen a couple times, but I had a host, an author on my podcast, and they started going on podcasts after they had released the book. And I asked a question, and he goes, man, everyone is asking that question. I really wish I would have put that in the book. And I was like, interesting. Like if you start going out a year before the book comes out, you may even realize that, man, everyone's asking the same question I didn't touch in the book. Maybe it'd be good for me to add that, like do a revision before it even comes out, basically. And I think that alone, like I remember hearing that, like, ooh, man, that's too bad. Like the book's out and everyone's asking you the same question that you didn't cover, but you may learn that along the way. And I think that alone is valuable to also just almost getting feedback about your book before it's even out just by discussing it.
Yeah, it definitely is. And then when I talk about host feedback, Tracy, I actually asked Tracy to have somebody on her show, and she came back to me and she said, that was the worst author interview I've ever had, because she would ask her questions and she'd say, oh, you have to read the book. You have to be prepared to talk about what's in your
Yes.
book and entice people into it. So, there are all these areas that it really does behoove you to get out there and get out there early. We actually have a media expert that we work with that books television and radio. And there are people prepare sound bites. And they're like, wait, what is a sound bite? That's exactly the kind of thing you want to have on a podcast, as well as I love that you're matching different hosts with different people, because you never want to get on and say the same thing, have a list of questions, or get off and say, like you were talking about, the host didn't ask me what I wanted them to ask me. Well, if it's not in the research materials, you're right, they're not going to ask
Yeah.
you. So it's great. So what tips do you have for the guests who a lot of times are brand new, filling out that media one sheet? What would you have suggestions for them to really supercharge them to make them matchable?
Yeah, definitely. And it's probably best that I follow along here. So I'm gonna pull one up real quick. That way I don't
Oh, do you want to share?
well, I don't need to share. No, I just
Okay.
want to make sure I'm not missing things that are important, because when I start talking, I tend to forget little details that matter a lot. So,
Okay.
first thing I'd mention that is important, kind of some of the obvious things, is to have some approved images, photos of yourself that can be used. So it could be like, if you have a book, maybe one of them is the cover of your book, maybe it's one of you holding the book, something like that. But having pictures taken that are professionally done really goes a long way. And I don't mean hiring a photographer. Granted, if you have the budget for that, go for it. But you can use any modern smartphone at this time. Like, the pictures that take are great. Like, most of them, I use iPhone, but Android has the same idea feature, if you will, like a portrait mode, where it's just like it looks super high quality. Put on something nice and get those pictures taken. I'm finding more and more, because of what you just mentioned, Juliet, like hosts wanting to create audiograms, sound bites, things like that. They want to use a high quality image. And if all you've got is a selfie of you in your closet, people might not want to share that, right, as a host. And something that's helped me a lot is I actually took some interesting photos where I left, basically I'm like on the right side of the picture, and it's in landscape mode, and the rest of it is all blank. And it looks like an awkward picture, but hosts love filling in an episode title there, putting a link there, right? So it's very attractive. The first thing people are going to see are your images. We're all visual creatures, right? So like, if you have a few images in your media kit, your media one sheet, and again, I recommend using Podmatch for this because it's digital and that's nice, right? It's like online, you can change it in real time. But think about like your pictures, like get creative with that. I think that's the first thing that I want to mention that's important, that's really easy.
So I want to address that for a minute. So are you saying like professional, casual, have a couple different choices? Because that's what we do when we build out Author Central. We want you to look professional, but we also want something approachable so that people aren't scared of you. So would you put a couple different kinds of photos on there?
Yes, absolutely. I would. And you want people to capture your essence. Like, I recently saw somebody who I talked to them before I talked to them, and like, it's funny, we weren't doing a podcast interview, but I went to their Podmatch profile, and all their pictures, they're like arms crossed, really serious. I talked to them, and they were like the most like bubbly, fun person I ever talked to. And I was just like, hey, your photos aren't on brand. I can tell by your personality. Like, you come across as this big, tough guy, but like, you're definitely more bubbly and nice and warm and welcoming, but I did not get that vibe. And so yeah, I think some should be professional, but it also needs to be in line with who you are, because people, again, they're going to look at your images. And I immediately saw this guy. I'm like, dang, he's probably gonna be pretty tough. And then I talked to him. I'm like, wow, so nice, so friendly. So like, yeah, have a mix, but make sure it does fit your personality. And again, maybe that's somebody on a smartphone taking your pictures that you're comfortable with. Maybe it's a photographer that can say, hey, this is really on brand for you. But at the end of the day, yeah, keep it simple, but have a variety. I love what you said there, Julia. That's so important to show yourself and have some professional ones as well.
Mm-hmm. Especially, we just did this with a book, Facing Financial Fears. I mean, obviously, financial planner. She is very serious, numbers oriented, but we had ski pictures in there and hiking pictures because she's also very outdoorsy and approachable. So, okay, what else on there?
So the next thing that's really important is your bio. So just a short little clip about you is so important to have, like something that's just a few sentences. This is what most podcast hosts, not all, but most podcast hosts are going to read this word for word,
Yes.
or maybe just change it a little bit. And one of the biggest problems I see guests make is they make the bio section super long. And then when you listen on a podcast, it's 3 minutes of a host reading about this person. You're like, oh my gosh, can we please get to the interview? Right? Like that's how I feel as a listener. I'm like, skip, 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 skip. I don't care about the last 30 years of your life. Mine, I actually just recently upgraded, upgraded. I updated the text. You can tell I'm in software when I use words like upgrade, but it's a single sentence. It's a bit of a run-on sentence. It's long, but it's one sentence, and that is my full bio. And I think it's important to really get it right, to say just something about you. Someone's like, ooh, this is interesting, but not so much they're like, oh my gosh, that's a lot, right? Like, I know everything about this person. Why do I need to listen to the interview? So getting your bio done right is really important. And Juliet, you know this, like on books, there's a bio section, which I don't know if it should be longer or shorter. If you have any feedback on that before I move on.
So yeah, when we work with our authors, they have a short bio, a medium bio, and a long bio. And we use the short on the back of the book and the longer on the medium one on the platform uploads, and then the longer on Author Central. But I was just on another call and I mentioned that in my early podcasting days, I had on a guest who sent me a 3-page bio. And I didn't research before I had him on. So I'm literally on the air reading it. And I got to the end. And of course, everything that pops in my head, I have to say. And I literally said, and that's today's show, because the bio was so long. Stopping by. And then I got to my guest, and I had to have it edited out because it was rude. But I was really like, dude, 3 pages. And he's a media guy.
My goodness. You know, I'm glad that you brought up though the short, medium, long, because the bio section on something like Podmatch should be the short one, but you also have like what's just about, but mine says about Alex, right? And that's where I'd put the long one, or maybe the medium one, depending on how long it is, right? Because in the day, if you're a guest pitching to a podcast hosts like to talk. I don't think they like to read that much necessarily, right? If they're going to read, they're going to read to research. So they do want to grab like your book or something like that, but they don't necessarily want to read about you too terribly much. So keep that in mind. So you will have that section as well. But the next section I want to bring up is a really important one, a desired call to action. I say desired because not all hosts will mention it, but like, where do you want listeners to be sent? So toward the end of most podcast episodes, the question will be asked, where can listeners find out more about you? Right? Or where do you want them to go? And this is actually, again, we like to put this in the profile because we like hosts to be able to see and get an idea of where guests are going to, or listeners, sorry, are going to end up. But what's really important is making sure it's a singular call to action. I actually find that a lot of guests get this really wrong, Juliet. What happens is they say, well, I'm on LinkedIn, really active. I was on another podcast last week you can check out. You can email me here. You can go to my website here. You can get my book there. And the thing is, you have to think about the listener. In the majority of cases, like when people listen to podcasts, they're not sitting at their computer waiting for you to drop a golden nugget. They're driving and they might pause it and do talk to text to save a note for later. Or they might be at the gym, like that's when I listen, or out for a walk or cleaning the house, right? Like it's audio, right? So most people are going to consume it in that format when they're doing something else. And if you tell them 5 things to do, they're not going to remember any of them. And so what you want to do is have one singular call to action that's very, very simple. Buy my book. It is titled this, here it is. Right. And something that if someone's driving, like, okay, I'll remember that. I just heard Juliet talk for a while. I can remember that. I can mentally log that away. I can quickly jot it down or look it up real fast here. It's really nice to have like a simple domain that like redirects. Even if it's, and I'm sure you preach this, but if it's on Amazon, don't say go to Amazon and search for it. Say go to xyzbook.com/buy or whatever, right? Like something really simple that someone's like, who's driving again, can say, I can remember that. I can get there. Anyway, that's my thought on a desired call to action. I think it's really important to have one singular one and to get that right.
It is. And here's the thing. If you send people over to Amazon, and let's take Alex as an example, Sanfilippo, I don't even know if I said it right, but how many different ways could I butcher that when I'm spelling? And if you don't have an exact match, not going to get there. And it's just like online marketing, one click, that's all people are going to give you. So have, alexbook.com and redirect in there. So that is great. Thank you for bringing that up, because people aren't going to go search for you unless you give them, but they will write down something very easy that will lead them there. And Alex, like I said, is a perfect example of that, because you wouldn't believe how many times when I was typing what goes with this morning, the show notes, how many times I misspelled your last name.
Well, it took me about 15 years to spell it right for myself. So I hear you on that. Which is funny because a lot of people say, Alex, why don't you just direct people to alexsanfilippo.com? I'm like, if I told you to go there right now, could you spell it? And
Yeah.
no, I'm like, well, no one can. Like, you're always going to get it wrong, right? If I bought the 30 variations that people use, maybe. But yeah, it's better to have something that, again, simple, easy to remember. And so I love that you preach that as well. I think that's just a great thing to do.
Yeah.
Moving later right along here, the next thing, like I mentioned this earlier, but it's great to, of course, like have also, side note here, have your social media links and stuff like that, right? Like that's good to have your website link on one of these media one sheets. Everyone can just quickly be able to find you if they want to do more exploring. Because the last thing you want them to do is say, oh, okay, they don't link to any of their social medias and they end up on someone else's social media that has the same name as you. I had that happen one time, and I asked this guy, thankfully, before we started recording, I'm like, you have this really weird book about skateboarding. What is that? And he just laughed. He goes, no, that's not me. That's somebody else. But if you had his social media link on his profile, I would have known that I clicked to the wrong person. So make sure you have those links handy. But now on to something that I just mentioned that I said I talked about earlier, but having some ideas for episode titles / main focus, right? Like you want to give podcasters a direction. I think that's a great thing to do and I like always writing these things in potential titles for episodes because most hosts aren't going to use them. But like example, I talk about podcasting. So like one of the things that's on my Podmatch profile says how to survive and thrive during your first year as a podcaster. That is a great episode title. You clearly understand what I'm going to be talking about, but also if a host wanted to copy paste that, they could use that very easily. And so I just think it's important to, again, give people the direction of like, hey, here's the things I want to talk about and list out a few of them. I say 3 to 5 is a good thing. And then right along with that, the next thing I would say is to have questions that you're always ready to answer. And one thing I don't recommend doing as an author is asking, like, telling people you're always ready to answer the question, what made you decide to write the book? Right? Like that's not a very deep question. A better one would be, what experience in your life led you to decide to write a book like this? Like you just took a very broad question that can be answered in a few words, like, I just have a lot of experience, to like, what is a specific experience? That's like an interesting question. So like I always tell people, like, make the question super involved and like really detailed. Most hosts are not going to read them word for word, but it gives them that direction of, okay, I'm going to dive into this person's past because they just gave me freedom to do that by saying I could ask this question. And it again gives you that opportunity to do that. And the last thing I'll mention here is to have any sort of shows or media that you've done before, like link to that stuff, because if somebody wants to consume something you've done previously, you want to give them direction to do that. The interviews go way better if a host listened to a guest on a previous episode, because then they can kind of get the cadence of your voice and understand how they're going to talk with you, right? And anyway, I digress. That's kind of everything I would put on a media one sheet personally. Again, like Podmatch does do that, but like you could easily do this on a PDF or something like that, whatever is going to be easy for somebody to do. And I just recommend having it at the end of the day, however you decide to.
Yeah, no, I love this. So you guys, when you go sign up for this, have all that prepped and ready to go, and you will be in and out of this in 5 minutes. If you know exactly, I think when I filled mine out, I did right off of one sheet, and I'm not even sure that I'm available for guesting. I think I only signed up for the hosting.
Oh, really? Okay.
People, I may go back and do it because we have some new stuff coming out, but people ask me to podcast all the time. So I don't, I'm not as proactive as I used to be about seeking them out, mostly because it means I have to wear makeup on days I don't want to. So I try to schedule you all at once so I can go back to my, I work at home, don't have to dress up look. So,
I love it. I respect that.
So Alex, where do we find you? What are the next steps for people who want to sign up?
Yeah. So, I mean, first off, again, like use Juliet's link, because again, that'll ensure that you always get the best price. That's joinpodmatch.com/superbrand. In addition to that, where I would send people is podpros.com/win, podpros.com/win. And on here, whether you want to be a podcast guest host or you already are a podcast guest or host, I just lay out 5 quick wins. Should take you less than 5 minutes to read. There's no opt-in or anything like that. They'll just help you level up and take your podcast guesting or hosting to the next level. So podpros.com/win.
Oh, thank you. We could all use that. Even a seasoned pros kind of getting the dregs here. So thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I love what you're doing this show. It's an honor to be back. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to continuing our friendship and relationship. And thanks everyone for checking this out.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.